Thank you all for joining us for our annual presentation of our CUSC survey results. This year, it's for 2022's first year student survey. So as you may be aware, CUSC has been around since 1994, Canada's oldest undergraduate student survey. And we have a 3-year cycle of surveys, first year, middle years, and graduating students. This time up, it was first year students. So it is going to be insightful for students who started their university careers during a pandemic. During our time, much of our time as an organization, Prairie Research Associates has been doing much of the work for us, and Nicholas Borodenko has been with us for several years. I don't want to out you for age or anything, but he's been along for the ride for a long time, and it's going to be Nicholas who takes us through the results this year. A couple of housekeeping items, because there's so many people. We are currently sitting at 41. It'll probably head towards 50 by the time we get everybody in. We have turned off video and audio for you. So if you have questions, please put them into the chat. And either I will address the question live, if I can do that, or ones that are better answered by Nicholas, we'll save for the end of things and have a bit of discussion at the end. So Nicholas, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Glenn, for that introductions. Yeah, so I've been working with CUSC for 17 years. So this is the 28th cooperative study of CUSC, which I have had the pleasure of being involved in for 17 of the past 20 years. And I wouldn't say this is the oldest study, it's the longest running study. It sounds much better than oldest study. So this year for the 2022 CUSC survey, it included 44 universities from across Canada, which is actually up from the previous iteration of the first year survey in 2019, where there were 34 participating universities. So quite a robust number of universities across Canada. This survey was sent to almost 50,000 first year students across Canada, yielding responses from over 15,000 first year students. And so when you see results in the survey, the base is out of that 15,000 first year students. Overall had a response rate of 31%, which is actually quite good. Normalized a little bit over the past few years, although the range amongst universities is wide ranging from 10% all the way up to 65%. A lot of those response rates have a lot to do with two components. One component is the size or magnitude of the incentive that institutions may be offering, or at least offering any, and also the number of contacts that they have. The more times you email students and remind them to do the survey, the higher those response rates tend to be. It is down a little bit from 34% in 2019, but not statistically that different. So institutions supply varying sample size. Some institutions do a census of first year students, some do a random selection of students. And what we do to present these results is they are weighted back to the full size of the student population. So those that may be doing a subselection of their students, they're weighted back to actually reflect the true population of first year students in the study. Throughout this presentation, we're looking at aggregate results, but we also talk a little bit about some differences amongst various groups. One of those key groups we look at is the size of the institution, and has historically been done for CUSC reporting. We look at institutions in terms of 3 sizes, so Group 1, Group 2, and Group 3. Group 1 tend to be small undergraduate universities, those that do not offer graduate programs, medical or law schools. Group 2 tend to be medium-sized institutions that offer some type of graduate studies, and Group 3 are typically the largest institutions that offer both graduate studies and will have a professional or law school. Okay, let's take a look at our results. Before we start looking at what students told us, let's take a look at, first of all, who students are. So these are first year students. So 3% of first year students have children, and 44% identified as a visible minority, and 86% are Canadian citizens. It's almost about a 2-to-1 ratio of females to males. So 65% are females and 35% are males. And this aligns very closely with what the actual population of students are that are provided to us. So it's not like we're over or underrepresenting any specific gender group here. This is pretty much in line with what we receive from institutions. The average age of first-year students, not surprised, about 19 years of age, and actually 84% of first-year students are under the age of 20. And so although the average is 19.4, the vast majority are under 20 years of age. 4% identify as Indigenous and 70% are single. One interesting difference here we find amongst groups is that visible minority students were more likely than non-visible minority students to identify as being single. 85% of visible minority students indicated they were single compared to 70% of non-visible minority students. In terms of citizenship, I mentioned that 86% are Canadians. The rest sort of followed. 9% identify as international students and 5% are permanent residents. So looking at disabilities, so 31% of students identify as having some type of disability or impairment. The numbers have gone up a bit since we did this in 2019, a little bit higher than they were then. The most common issue we find among students is mental health. 20% identify as having a mental health issue. However, when we look at these as a whole to say, well, how many of them impact them daily? So these would be disability that impacts them on a daily basis. That number drops from 31% to 10%. And again, with the most common being mental health at 6%. Other common issues amongst, besides mental health, neurodivergence is at 8%, learning and memory at 5%, vision at 4%, and other chronic conditions at 3%. Looking at what students' living arrangements are. So 49%, about half of students are living with their family. So they're living with family or relatives, typically more likely to be their parents. And then you've got almost another half-ish who are renting some type of housing, a mix of on and off campus housing. And then 5% own a home. Compared to 2019, there are fewer students living on campus. In 2019, it was 40% who were living on campus, 30% this year. And again, a lot of that has to do with the changing institutions, right? So as different institutions participate, those numbers are going to vary from survey to survey. Do find a few differences here in terms of living arrangements. Group 1 students, so those in the smallest institutions, were most likely to be living independent from their family, so least likely to be living with their family, and group students were most likely to prefer to be living on campus if given the choice. Also differences here amongst visible minority students. So visible minority students were less likely to be living on campus than non-visible minority students. Only 24% of visible minority students were living on campus compared to 37% of non-visible minority students. Let's take a look at first-year students' academic profile. And so this is provided by institutions. So 89% were studying full-time. 6% had transferred from some other institution prior to this year. And 84% said they had a B- or higher average, with 37% reporting an A- or higher. Some differences here amongst institutions. Group 1 institutions, those smallest institutions, had the highest proportion of students who were studying part-time. Almost 20% of Group 1 students were studying part-time. Also some differences here by the age of students. The older a student is, the more likely they were to have started at a post-secondary institution earlier or have transferred from another institution. So looking at their motivation for attending, what motivates students to attend university? So first thing in terms of motivators. So we look at motivators in terms of what students rated as very important or important versus what they said was the most important. You can see here that at the top end, the things they rated as very important or important tend to be aspects related to employment, more likely to get a job, preparing for a specific job, and getting a fulfilling job. That's sort of followed by aspects related to their education, learning things, getting a broad education, or making a positive difference. At the lower end, so things that are less likely to be motivators and aren't shown here, things like they didn't have anything better to do, with 17% rated as important, and 12% rated a chance to participate in varsity athletics. When we look at, so the students who rated as most important, so this is a follow-up question, we say, okay, how important was this? And now select what is the most important aspect for attending university. You can see a little bit of a shift here, where right at the top is to prepare for a specific job. So when we say what's the most important thing, it's to get a very specific job that I'm thinking of. But you can see the top 3 motivators continue to be aspects related to job. And so when you say what's the most important, you're looking at more than half of students who are coming for a reason, an employment-related reason. We do find some differences here, especially by age. Younger students are more likely to say that factors such as meeting their family's expectations or meeting new people, which aren't necessarily shown in this slide, the younger they are, the more important they say those aspects are. So family, meeting new people, much more important to younger first-year students. Also a small difference here, but a difference amongst students who identify as a visible minority. They put more importance on meeting their family's expectations than those who do not identify as a visible minority. So that's choosing to go to university. Now let's talk about choosing which university they're going to go to. And so what we find is 77% of students apply to other universities. And on average, they apply to 2.2 other universities. So realistically, they apply to about 3 universities on average. 15% also applied to a college or cégep. And in spite of this, in spite of applying to about 3 universities, about 8 in 10, 79% say they are attending their first choice university. Now, of course, this would be a very interesting question to ask students before they come. A lot of this will be some, self-fulfilling prophecies. Well, if I went here, it must have been my first choice. But it'd be interesting to say what their first choice would have been when they were applying, as opposed to now. A few differences here by the size of institution. Students attending those sort of mid-sized institutions, so group 2 universities, were most likely to have applied to other universities. 87% of them applied to other universities. And group 3 students, so that's the ones at the largest institutions, were most likely to have applied to a college or cégep. 24% of students attending the largest institutions also applied to a college or cégep. A few other things. The older a student is, the less likely they were to have applied to multiple universities. So the older they get, the more likely they are to have applied to a single university. So what's the top motivator for selecting their universities? So we look at the motivation. So again, looking at the percent that rate things as very important or important, you can see that the program they want to take immediately sort of jumps out as being sort of the leader in the clubhouse in terms of what motivates them to select their university. So the university has the program I want. And when you ask them to say, well, what is the most important? You can see again, having the program they want sort of jumps out. 29%, almost 1 in 3 students say having the program was the most important factor when choosing my university. Few differences here by age. The older a student was, the less likely that to rate several factors as important, with the exception of some other aspects. So older students were just as likely to rate having the program they want to take, the academic reputation, and the cost of tuition. So there was almost no difference by age groups. Otherwise, older students tend to rate almost all the factors related to the university as less important. Also, some differences here by visible and non-visible minority students. Visible minority students were more likely to rate several factors as more important. Having a co-op program or work experience program was more important to visible minority students, and also the availability of public transportation was more important to visible minority students. So looking at motivators for international students. So these are questions specifically intended for international students, and these are factors that are rated as very or important. So you see sort of 3 stand out amongst these 5 factors that were asked about. These 3 sort of group together. whereas friends or family or obtaining a visa in terms of importance were not as important as the cost, the welcoming environment, and the reputation of Canadian universities to international students. When we look at sources of information, so what sources of information did they use to make those decisions about going or visiting their institution? So these are sort of the top factors. What we find at the top, university website sort of ranks number 1. This is followed by 2 factors that sort of group together. Parents and other students who attended the university sort of fall into what you might call second place. And then you sort of get these other factors in terms of most important, sort of grouping together in sort of what you might call a third tier. Contact with admission staff or professors, friends, high schools, printed information, or an open house visit. Factors that are at the lower end that aren't shown here, the Globe and Mail, only 13%, the Globe and Mail University report, only 13% rated that as important or very important. University's Facebook site is 8%, and contact with athletic coaches was only 8%. A few differences here. The older a student is, the less likely they are to rate parents as important, not surprising. Also some differences here by students who are visible minority versus non-visible minority. Visible minority students rated several aspects as being more important. These tend to be factors like the QS World University Rankings, the academic rankings of universities, and the Times Higher Education rankings. So looking now at orientation. So now we've gotten students to university. What happens when they get there? So about half of students attended orientation. And of course, this is sort of a unique year, or 2020 was a unique year for COVID and how orientations were done. But 50%, which is interesting because this number did not change dramatically from past years. So typically orientation has sort of sat around high 50s-ish in terms of attending. So it did drop a little bit, but not that much different. So I know a lot of institutions went to virtual orientations at the beginning of the year. That did not seem to help get students to attend orientation. So in terms of how satisfied for those who attended university, how satisfied were they with various components? So it's 3 sort of rank higher in terms of how satisfied they were, feeling welcome, providing information, and providing information about campus life. And then ranking slightly below that is helping them understand academic expectations, building their confidence, and helping with their transition to university. One factor I want to point out, there's a difference. The older a student was, the older a first-year student was, the less likely they were to have attended orientation. So the older they are, the less likely they feel they need to get some sort of orientation to their university. Okay, so looking at registration. So in terms of the registration, 84% were satisfied with getting into all the courses they wanted, and generally 79% were satisfied with the registration process as a whole, with almost no differences here between any groups. Looking at how the university has met their expectations, so we've got them there. How does it compare to their expectations? And we lump them into 3 groups. So we say to start, 65%, so 2/3 say, yep, the university met my expectations. 16% say they were exceeded, and 19% say they fell short. So slightly more saying they fell short than exceeded. In terms of aspects related, we also find that students, there's a relationship here between expectations and students' grades. The lower the student grades, the less likely they are to say that their expectations were exceeded, and more likely to say that they fell short. So now that they're transitioning to university, what successes and challenges they have transitioning to university. So when we look at the various components, what we find is the areas that students had the most success transitioning, finding information about academic integrity, understanding course material, choosing a program, meeting academic demands, and performing well in written assignments tend to rank as highest in terms of success. And these are students who rated it as some or very much success. When we look at the bottom 5, so areas where they had least success, finding suitable housing, career info, using the library, and making friends, but the one that sort of has the least success is being involved in campus activities, of course, This is probably heavily influenced by the pandemic and the number and types of campus activities that were going on, or even if students were on campus at all. A couple factors here related to success. Age impacts making friends. The older a student is, the less likely they are to say they had success making friends. Also, relationship here amongst grades. The lower the student's reported grade, the less success they had in a number of areas, including meeting academic demands, performing well in written assignments, performing well in courses that require math, understanding their course material, and managing their time. And so we do find that students do have a high level of self-awareness, given that correlation between their grades and their success. So looking at their educational experiences. So what students do is they rate their professors on a number of different aspects. I think it's 16 different aspects they rate them on. And so what we see on the left here is the top 5 areas for performance. So this is how well professors do. And professors, generally speaking, over time have performed or scored very, very well, received very high rankings from students. What we do find here, though, is we ask students, say, okay, rate these areas in terms of performance. Now tell us which of these are most important for professors to have. So of interest, we see very little overlap between the areas that professors are performing the best and what is important. The only factor that sort of overlaps in that top 5 is seeming knowledgeable in what they are teaching. These other areas, in terms of what's most important, in terms of how they rank in performance, communicate well ranks 9th, well organized is 7th, providing useful feedback is 11th, and being intellectually stimulating is 10th. And so the areas that professors are succeeding most at doesn't necessarily correlate highest to what students feel is most important. So looking at their ability to evaluate their teaching, so students were asked if they were able to evaluate the teaching in their courses. What we find is 11% said, I have not been able to evaluate teaching in any of my courses. About half said some or most, and then 42% said they were able to evaluate teaching in all of their courses. Do you find a difference here across a couple things? Group 3 universities, so that's the largest universities, were most likely to have students who said they were not available to evaluate any of the teaching in their courses. What we also find too is certain age groups, specifically students who are 20 or 21 years of age, were least likely to say they were able to evaluate the teaching in all their courses. So how satisfied were they with the quality of teaching in the course? So a very key indicator. So in terms of how much they agree that they're satisfied with the quality of teaching, about 17% disagree that they're satisfied with the quality of teaching. And then about the other 72-ish% with some rounding agree. Although you can see it's not a lot who strongly agree. So you would say would be very satisfied with the quality of their teaching. A lot of them are just simply in that agreement category. This has been fairly common over time. So looking at perceptions of staff, so we have 2 questions about staff. Generally speaking, students are very satisfied with teaching of staff. Teaching assistants are helpful. And support staff are helpful. These are the proportion who agree or strongly agree. So now that they're here, what's their commitment to completion? How likely are they to complete? What sort of issues are they having? So what we find is 94% agree or strongly agree that they're willing to put in the effort into their studies. We find that 87% say they normally go to all classes. I think it's interesting wording. I normally go to all classes, which is either, I guess it's normal or not. 66% say they agree or strongly agree that they can deal with stress, and 62% say they have good study habits. We do find some correlation here with grades. So as students' reported grades decrease, they're also less likely to agree that they deal with stress and have good studying habits. In terms of the perception of their education, 82% agree that most of their courses are interesting. 77% believe their course load is manageable. 75% say they are in the right program for them. and 75% had adequate information about the program before enrolling. Of interest here, we find almost no difference here by students in their reported grades, whereas we did with other aspects on the previous slide. In terms of perceptions of finances, finance is always a key component of university life. 74, so 3/4, believe they have the financial resources to complete the program, but only 62% believe or agree that a university degree is worth the cost. So in terms of persistence, are they coming back next year? 86% say they plan to come back to their university the following year. So that would be for the 2022-23 year. And it drops down slightly to 82% who plan to complete their degree at their university. So it's a small percentage, it's 4%, but immediately there are some students who say they're coming back but don't plan to complete their degree here, which is interesting. 10% say they plan to transfer to another university next year, and 8% plan to transfer to college. And so you sort of look at this and go, well, what the 10% and 8%, that's 18%. How can 18%? But there is some overlap here. So there are students who believe they are both going to transfer to university and transfer to college next year, basically indicating that they're going somewhere else. Perhaps they're applying to both colleges and other universities next year, which is why this isn't necessarily a perfect overlap with this 86%. There are actually some students who say they plan to come back to university or agree or strongly agree, but also agree that they're also planning to transfer. So it's not always perfect in terms of students' thought process. So in terms of their overall evaluations, so another key indicators here. So their decision to attend this university, so how satisfied are they with the decision to attend, and how satisfied are they with the concern for them as an individual. You can see in here, they're more satisfied with their decision to attend this university than their concerns shown for them as an individual. Almost 90% are satisfied or very satisfied with their decision to attend this university, which is in line with the previous slide around the 86-ish% who agree or strongly agree that they plan to come back to the university the following year. In terms of recommending their university to others, so the net promoter score question. So would they recommend their university to others? So for those unfamiliar, it's a question asked on a 0 to 11 or 0 to 10 scale. So it's an 11-point scale. And what we do is we group students into 3 categories. And these are going to be promoters, passives, or detractors. What we find is 26% would be considered promoters of their universities, those who rate it a 9 or 10 on the 11-point scale. 49% would be passive, so those would be people who rate it a 7 or 8. And 25% are detractors, those people who rate it a 6 or lower. To create your net promoter score, you take your promoters minus your detractors, you get a score of +1. So what does +1 mean? +1 means at least it's positive. +1, though, is not in terms of sort of the net promoter score theory. It's not super great. Typically, +20 or higher indicates a strong commitment to the brand or the institution. There are some differences here by group or size of university. So group 1 students, those are students attending the smallest universities. They have a net promoter score of +10. Group 2 students, so those be students attending sort of medium-sized universities, they have a net promoter score of -5 or -5, meaning they have more detractors than promoters. And looking at group 3 universities, they have a net promoter score of +5, so slightly more promoters than detractors. Just to give some context to this, the graduating student survey, so that was the 2021 CUSC survey, that had a net promoter score of 0. So that almost an even number or an exactly even number of promoters and detractors. And the middle year student had a net promoter score of -1. Now, with that being said, first year students in 2019, their net promoter score was +14. So there's 2 things potentially going on here. One is, again, a different mix of institutions. As you remember, there were significantly more institutions participating this year than in 2019. Some of this could also just simply be related to the pandemic. These first year students are coming into university that was very different than perhaps they had imagined it pre-pandemic. And so when you ask them would they recommend their university, it may simply be an issue of recommending university as a whole than potentially this university. Oops. So now looking at goal development. So when we look at goal development, 76% say they have chosen their major at this point in their studies. They also 32% say they have a specific career in mind, and about 20% say they know their career options very well. And 26% post-graduation intend to apply to a professional program, and 30% intend to apply to graduate school. In terms of also looking at some postgraduate plans, we also ask students what they have done to sort of make plans to prepare for employment or career after graduation. Most students have done very little to sort of prepare for that postgraduate employment. Typically, they've done things that would not be considered really strong indicators of employment. They've done things like talk to their parents or family about it. They've talked to friends, they've talked to professors, or they've worked in their chosen employment field. In terms of the facilities and services students use, one of my favorite areas of the CUSC survey, I love to see students' satisfaction or dissatisfaction with various results. So we asked students about 26 different services they use, and so these are the most commonly used services. So at the top, we see their online bookstore and on-campus bookstore. So students need those books, so they're getting them either in person or online. And that's followed by library, e-resources, food services, and then down to their on-campus library. Do you see some differences in terms of use by several groups? The older a student was, the less likely they are to have used the bookstore, whether it be online or on campus, less likely to use university residences, and less likely to use food services. Also some differences here by students who identify as a visible minority. Students who identify as a visible minority were less likely to report using the online bookstore, the on-campus bookstore, less likely to have used parking as well. Then when we get into satisfaction with services, so generally speaking, students are very satisfied. 85% or more who have used those services are satisfied with them, with 3 exceptions. University residences at 78% are satisfied, food services at 69%, and then parking at 56%. So imagine parking at a time when almost no one is driving and parking because they didn't have to be on campus, and still only 56% are satisfied with parking. What they're really dissatisfied is paying with parking, not necessarily the amount of parking. It's just the idea of parking and paying for parking is just always going to be dissatisfied. So even when, if you ever wanted to do a test of parking, you would take an entire year of pandemic where almost no one had to drive and be there, or at least very few students probably in a lot of universities, and you probably still had low levels of satisfaction with parking. So what's their current employment look like? So we gather some information about employment. 39% of first-year students are employed. This is a little bit lower than we've seen in some past years. So again, some pandemic-related aspects here. Typically, I think with other first-year students, we're typically closer to the 45, inching to the 50% mark, so a little bit lower than we've seen in past years. Although 29% said they were seeking work at the time of the study. So for those who are employed, they work about 17 hours a week, so just about half of a full-time-ish job. And in terms of the impact that their employment has on their academic performance, 12% of students say their employment has a positive impact on their academic performance, which I always find interesting to indicate sort of how. I often assume that employment must be related to their studies in some way. 46% say it has no impact on their academic performance, and then 42% say it has a negative impact. A few differences here in terms of employment. On average, students attending Group 1 universities tend to work more on average. They work about 5 hours a week more, and that's very much related to the fact that, if you remember at the beginning, Group 1 students, those at the smallest universities, tend to be the most likely to be going to school part-time. Also, a lot of differences here by age. The older a student is, the more likely they were to be employed, and they work more hours on average per week. Looking at finances, so looking at credit cards, 56% of students had at least one credit card. Amongst those who had a credit card, 86% do not carry a monthly balance, indicating they pay off their balance each month. For those who are carrying a balance, they carry a balance of just over $3,000 on their credit cards. Some differences here. Group 1 students tend to carry a higher credit card debt, so those attending the smallest institutions than those attending Group 2 or Group 3 institutions. And also the older student was more likely they were to have a credit card, and the more likely they were to carry a balance on their credit card, although their average debt was not that different by age. In terms of receiving financial awards from their university, 61% received a financial award from their university, and amongst those students, 33%, so about a third of 61%, which is about 20-ish%, give or take, say they would not have been able to attend without that financial award. Students attending Group 2 universities were most likely to say they had received a financial award compared to Group 1 and Group 3 universities. Also, a lot of differences here by students' reported grades. The higher the student grade, the more likely they were to have reported having received a financial award. Also by age, the older a student was, the less likely they were to report having received a financial award. So some results on the course delivery and assessment model. So the course delivery and assessment model, for the past few years, CUSC has added a module to assess aspects that are relevant or important to this cohort. This one focuses on students, how courses were delivered this term, their satisfaction with it, and their ability to assess those types of course deliveries. Now, this module was not for all institutions, so institutions were able to opt in or out of this assessment module. The majority of universities did opt into this module, although I believe about 20%, about 16-ish% did not. So, looking at their method of instruction. So how did students receive instruction this year? So 4 ways they could receive instruction. And again, there's multiple response here, so students could receive multiple types of instruction. So you can see 71% had some type of online, asynchronous, 7% had synchronous online, 61% had a hybrid, and 56% of students had some type of in-person lectures. A couple differences here. We do find that students attending Group 1 university, so the smallest, were least likely to have online synchronous instruction amongst institutions. Also, older students were less likely to have taken online synchronous, hybrid, or in-person instruction. In terms of satisfaction with the type of instruction, so the interesting part about satisfaction is, as we will see, satisfaction increases by those who used it less often. So you can see the least used instruction in person, 91% were satisfied. Online asynchronous, which was the most commonly used at 71%, had the lowest satisfaction ratings from students. So, if you ever wanted to point to what students want, the in-person seems to be where they are most satisfied. And even as you drop to this hybrid model, satisfaction drops down by 10%, and you sort of remove that in-person, you're looking at satisfaction ratings around the 70-ish% mark. In terms of internal experiential learning, so that was learning that took place on campus, or not necessarily on campus, but their experiential learning. So this would be things like co-ops, labs, practicums, studio, applied projects, so things that could be in or outside the university, so experiential learning. Overall, 40% of students had some type of experiential learning. Most of it was done in person. 15% was online synchronous, 12% was hybrid, and just 9% had experiential learning that was just online and asynchronous. Here, satisfaction, again, in line with what we saw on the previous slide, satisfaction tends to be higher when you have some type of in-person component to it. So again, highest for in-person, second highest for hybrid, and less satisfaction with the online either synchronous or asynchronous modules. Now looking at methods they use to assess their courses. So how was their courses assessed? So 59% used some sort of online asynchronous model to assess. 58% used an online synchronous model in real time. 46% did it in person, and 30% did it in some sort of hybrid mode. And you can see here, assessing the course satisfaction virtually the same across the 4 types. So there's a key difference in terms of, as you'd imagine, how students take their learning versus how they assess their learning, and how satisfied they are. So they seem to be more satisfied with aspects of in-learning, in-person learning. In terms of assessment, does not seem to really matter to students in terms of how they actually assess those at the end of the day. And one final question, this module was asking for how satisfied they were with their university's efforts to limit the spread of COVID. 88% were satisfied with those efforts. This exact same question was asked amongst graduating students in the 2021 survey, and that satisfaction was 95% amongst graduating students, so down slightly from the previous year. Completely different cohort though. So one other aspect to talk about in terms of the results is from year to year, CUSC does do some experimentation to learn more about various components about the study. So often related to response rates, factors related to the impact on responses, data quality. And so the experiment done for 2022 was to test the hypothesis about whether or not allowing students to non-respond to a question. So to choose an answer of I prefer not to answer, what does this do to response rates? And so in conjunction with the CUSC board, 5 questions were selected to add an option of prefer not to answer. And these were typically given to questions where we receive the most feedback from students in regards to questions that they do not like to answer. And so these 5 questions, so the questions that were selected were how many credit cards do they have, what students' marital status is, if they have any disabilities or impairments, their ethnicity, and if they identify as Indigenous, what is their Indigenous background? And so to each of these questions, the option of prefer not to answer was given. Now, institutions, again, could opt to participate in the experiment. So not all institutions opted in, and they could, if they opted in, a minimum of 10% of students were selected to receive the prefer not to answer. And in some cases, some universities opted to have all students have the ability to see the prefer not to answer. So what does this experiment look like? So the first thing we looked at is what does it do in terms of the proportion of students who simply just say, I prefer not to answer, because that is the key component. What we find is there actually is a difference between the 5 questions and those who say, I prefer not to answer. So you can see amongst those 5 questions, the range in terms of the proportion who say prefer not to answer ranges from 4% for ethnicity all the way up to 7% for credit card, or 7.7% for disability. So there's a range here. So it means from a data standpoint, at an institutional level, it means that anywhere from say 4 to 8% of students who see the prefer not to answer option will select that, which is potentially a significant number of non-responses, because this is now data where we have no information for those students. But the other interesting part is, so this is an expected result, right? We expected students would select I prefer not to answer. We gave it to them. Of course, some are going to select it. It's a thing. When you give people an option, that's what happens. So there appears also to be an unintended consequence of adding a prefer not to answer that seems to cause students to drop out of the survey at a slightly higher rate than those who were not given. So the first question, if I go back, slide here. So the first question they saw that gave a prefer not to answer was how many credit cards they have, which happens to come just before the demographic questions in the survey, things like marital status, ethnicity, and whether or not they, what type of Indigenous they identify with. And so what happens is, so that question, that credit card question, comes just before question in the CUSC survey known as Live 1. And this is the first demographic question. And in order for a survey to count as being completed, students have to get to this question, which is about 80% of the questions on the survey. So at this point, at the Live 1 question, students in the non-experiment, so students who did not see the prefer not to answer, none of them dropped out at this point. Sorry, when they got past the from the credit card question to Live 1. Clearly many students dropped out before that to be considered completion, but from the credit card question to Live 1, so credit cards come just before this Live 1 question, none of the non-experiment students dropped out, moving from that question to the other. But what happens is, for those students who saw the prefer not to answer, almost 1% of them dropped out at the next question. So they said to the credit card question, I prefer not to answer. And then the next question, they stopped doing the survey. So for the non-experiment, none of them dropped out at the next question. They all answered the next question. Whereas 1% dropped out, which seems to indicate that giving an answer prefer not to respond seems to have slightly triggered something in students to say, hold on, I have the ability to not respond, so why am I doing this survey? So now what happens is you take that 5-ish% of students, or 4 or 5 or 6% who are not answering the question, and now you're almost adding a whole other percent of students you're losing, because that prefer not to respond seems to tell students, hey, something about the survey may not be important, or if I don't have to give an answer, why am I even doing this survey? And what happens is, by the time you get to the end, so over the course of the demographic questions, the percentage of students who drop out is 1.9% in the experimental group compared to only 1% in the non-experimental group. So it doesn't increase that drastically by getting to the end, but it seems like that first question basically triggers about 1-ish% of students to drop out. And so it almost doubles the dropout rate in that sort of back 10 to 15-ish demographic questions. And so there was this sort of unintended result from the experiment that indicates that adding a prefer not to respond has an unintended impact from simply just allowing students to not give an answer. It also seems to potentially increase response rate or decrease response rates. And if you think about it, only 31% of students complete the survey. So even a 1% drop does have an impact on data quality. So that is the presentation for 2022. Looking forward to 2023 before we take some questions. So 2023 is the CUSC survey of middle year students. And that survey focuses on a number of items, focuses on what institutional activities they're taking part of, looks at their growth and development of skills, which is something we don't do in the first year because they've just got there. So now that they're in the middle years, how are they developing? Similar with satisfactions with services, professors, and the like, their commitment to completing. So a lot of the commitment questions we ask here are also asked in the middle years. Now looking at their educational and career goals, and more aspects related to their finances, which is not covered in depth in the first year student survey. Also, the recording from this presentation will be shared on CUSC YouTube channel in September and available on the website if people would like to view this again, listen to my dulcet tones, or share with their colleagues and others. And also, CUSC 2022 AGM is going to be held virtually on Tuesday, November 8th at 12 p.m. Eastern. And you can look forward to emails and communication about that AGM, where CUSC will give more information about the 2023 survey. So that wraps up my component of the presentations. So we'll look to see if there are any questions. So if you put them into the chat and Glenn was not able to answer them, or there are additional questions you would like to ask, please feel free to put those into the chat and we will deal with those now.
Yeah, there's two sets of questions.
Mm-hmm.
David asked a question earlier about the evaluation of teaching, and just to clarify, the question was whether they were given the opportunity to evaluate teaching. So it's not the students feeling like they, as an individual, couldn't evaluate teaching. It was the opportunity. And then we've got two other questions. One is about the financial award percentage. and how it compares to previous years, and whether there are differences between Group 1 and Group 2 in that. I don't know if you have that sort of
so I
of your fingers.
off the top of, oops, sorry, just wrong slide. So off the top of my head, I don't remember how this compares to previous years. It's not jumping out. I'd have to go back and look. It's not jumping out as being hugely different to me for first year survey.
So in 2019, it was 64%.
There you go. Yeah, so that's what I thought. So it was fairly close. And then there is, Group 2 students. So those attending those sort of medium-sized universities with a graduate program, they were the most likely to say that they received a financial award. So there is a difference there by the size of university.
All right. The other questions focus around the things connected to the experiment.
Mm-hmm.
So one is asking whether we can remind our listeners if these questions were compulsory or optional, regardless of whether the student was in the experimental group or not. And then there's another one about the option to skip a question where no questions were set to required to respond.
Yeah, so
maybe you can talk about that.
Yeah, so the demographic questions, students can skip by them. So demographic would start at Live 1, so just ahead of this marital status question. So credit cards is a required question. And then once students get to these demographic questions, they can not give a response. I will say very, very, very few students, after answering 100+ questions, by the time they get to the demographics, even realize they can hit the skip forward button and just continue answering. Like, it is a very, very small percentage. It's like point something, like it's not even very large. So yes, it has almost no impact because it's sort of, there's no, we don't put any bells and whistles or information in that section to say, oh, by the way, you can start skipping. It would be another interesting experiment to say, oh, by the way, now you can start hitting that forward button to see if that has any difference to the prefer not to answer. But yeah, so that starts at Live 1, which is the very first demographic question. So as I said here, that's sort of where we start to see that dropout difference between the two groups.
Right. And perhaps we should note for individuals from Alberta institutions, for Alberta institutions, 100% of the institutions were required to participate in the experiment, and 100% of the sample was in that experiment. So in your own data, just be aware that everybody was in, so you won't see a distinction between the two groups.
That's true. That's a good point.
All right, so there's a really big question here in chat. Go for it, Nicholas. Tell us if you can highlight any big changes, biggest changes over the last 3 years, and comparing that to the previous 5.
Yeah, so I would say that the biggest differences we've seen sort of pre and post COVID in this, and again, it's very difficult at the aggregate level to assess changes because, as I mentioned, just going to the fact that in 2019 you had 34 institutions participate compared to 44 this year, those changing institutions make it very difficult to solidly say that the differences are due to a change within the sort of national scope of post-secondary university education relative to, oh, is it different because these institutions participated and there's something slightly funky about them. I think some changes we've seen, we see a higher proportion of students, and this is probably not COVID related, but seeing a higher proportion of students identify as having a disability. That sort of continually creeps up every single year. And then I think the biggest difference by far is in this section. Where is it? Is in use. This use of service is so much different than pre-COVID, simply because, as you imagine, they're on campus less. And so these numbers for institutions that participated in past years, when you're looking at your use, like that's where you're going to see the biggest changes in use. Satisfaction didn't seem to change that much. As I mentioned, when we talk about parking, like here's a perfect example where you think satisfaction should change because you're talking about a time when 3 years ago or 6 years ago or whatever it is, parking should always be full and always be terrible. Now at a time when almost no one was parking and you could walk down empty streets on campus, you'd think this satisfaction would have increased significantly, and it did not. So this is by far the biggest use in terms of sort of like ongoing trends. We don't see much in terms of trends other than a lot of, the use stuff does tend to change, but student satisfaction tends to be, a lot of the satisfaction questions tend to be fairly on par with pre-COVID, which, tells me students, either adapted or sort of changed their expectations around, what, they may have been just as satisfied because they knew going in, what this COVID year was going to look like. And so they had already adapted and changed, because they should have realistically, this tells me, when we see this difference in satisfaction by method of instruction, that, with more students taking online than would have happened 3 years ago, you think you would have seen a lot of higher dissatisfaction with professors and dissatisfaction with their education, and that didn't happen. And so it tells me a lot of students were already adapting to the changing landscape of COVID.
Right. The one other thing I'll just toss in is for services, institutions made changes in how they were delivering those.
Mm-hmm.
So, ramping up, if you didn't have an online bookstore, adding an online bookstore or making it more prominent. And similarly with library e-resources, finding ways of making those more readily available to students, or at least making students aware of them in a way that they may not have before. We've got one more question.
Yep.
What happens to students that don't identify as male or female, whether they're removed from the results? So maybe you can
they're not
talk about that one.
Correct. They're not removed from the results. When we do, they make up such a small proportion that we're not. So when we make comparisons, we do actually analyze all the data comparing males and females. We find, as is the case historically, find almost no differences between men and women. Those students who don't identify as male or female, so identify as non-binary or another gender distinction, they're not removed from the analyses, like they're included in all these aggregate level results. But when we're comparing, that group isn't large enough to compare to men and women as a whole, because they make up about 1-ish% of students in the sample files. Also, too, male and female is something that is captured by the institutions and provided to us in their sample file. It's not a question we ask. So it's also how well each institution captures that as well when supplying that to us in their data set. So included in the survey, included in the sample. Just from an analysis standpoint, the group is not large enough for us to analyze to compare differences to their male or female counterparts.
Right. We just to advertise a bit, in the next survey, so the 2023 survey, we are adding an EDI related module that will do more or allow people to identify as a variety of genders and orientations. So we will be directly asking students that for the first time. So that may reveal more information than what we have now.
Yep.
Then there's a question about where do they drop off? What percentage of the survey is the point where most students leave? And does the length of the survey affect the response rate?
So that's a great question. So your first part of the question, after which question do most students leave? The answer is the first page. I did a presentation at SERPA in, I want to say 2015 or 16, where we looked at participation rates. So there's 2 points where students drop off. The first point is the first page. Students click the link, open the survey, get to the first question, and like, nope, done. That's where they drop off. After that, the big drop-off point is when they get to the first bank of questions where they see like 16 questions where they have to rate it on a scale. Once they hit that first bank, that's where you see the next precipitous drop-off. So that you get another 10-ish% of students who drop off. So what we find is about 70 to 75% of students who start the survey complete the survey. The second part of your question, does survey length affect the response rate? It is something we are going to be testing, experimenting in the 2023 survey using a shorter version. However, we did a similar-esque experiment about, I want to say 8 to 10 years ago. And the answer to that was no, the length of the survey does not affect the response rate. Whether the survey was the length it is now or like a version that was a third of the size, the response rates were exactly the same. And what it tells us is students are either going to do the survey because they want to do the survey, or they're not going to do it. We know that what affects response rates are the individual themselves, like there are just certain individuals who are more keen to doing the survey, but also the other component is the incentive. Institutions that offer a incentive that actually incents and draws students typically get higher response rates. So does the length affect? Not a whole bunch.
All right. So as Nicholas said, that is an experiment that we're going to do next year to sort of confirm the previous observations. Thank you, Nicholas, for taking us through this. I know we're a bit long on time, so I won't spend too much time, but do look for a webinar coming up on how to register for the coming survey. And thank you all for attending.